Welcome to Galaxy Brains.
An infinite amount of cash.
I'm your host, Alex Thorn.
The U.S. banking system is sound and resilient.
Bitcoin made a new all-time high.
If you're not long, you're short.
Satoshi's going to come on there, laugh hysterically, go quiet, all Bitcoin's going to be erased.
Bitcoin's the best crypto out there.
Bitcoin is going to zero.
Welcome back to Galaxy Brains. As always, I'm your host, Alex Thorn, head of firm-wide research at Galaxy. Bitcoin not zero, and we have a great episode for you today. Professor Bradley Rettler from the University of Wyoming, a philosophy professor and executive director at Wyoming's Bitcoin Research Institute, is our guest. We'll talk about what it means to talk about Bitcoin in philosophical terms, educating academia about Bitcoin, and what he has planned at the new Bitcoin Research Institute there. Of course, we'll also check in with our good friend Beimnet Abebe from Galaxy Trading. As always, lots to talk about. Bitcoin all-time highs, new all-time highs hit at the same time. Bond markets flashing danger, causing lots of volatility. Before we get into all of that, I need to remind you to please refer to the link to the disclaimer in the podcast notes, and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice or an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. What a week for Galaxy, going live on the NASDAQ last Friday. Also, Bitcoin all-time highs as I record this on Wednesday, May 21st. Also, huge news out of Washington, D.C. this week as the Senate passed a key cloture vote on the Genius Act. That's the stablecoin bill on Monday night, at first with 66 voting in favor and 32 opposed. You need 60 plus to avoid a filibuster and advance the bill. But even this morning on Wednesday, 3 more senators changing their votes to yes. The margin now 69 to 31. So that bill will now head to the floor of the Senate for a maximum of 30 hours of debate. There'll be debate about amendments, and maybe some amendments will be added. Those amendments will need 60 votes to be added, but ultimately the bill will only need a simple majority to pass. Very likely now that a comprehensive framework for stablecoins will pass the Senate, and then I would say 75% chance that it passes the House and lands on the president's desk before August recess in Congress. Big deal for the United States. Dollar dominance. New buyer of U.S. debt. This, I believe, I've been arguing, is not a crypto bill. Cryptocurrency firms can already issue stablecoins. In fact, this creates new strict federal regulation on stablecoin issuers in the United States, where none currently exists. Opponents of the bill have been claiming it's some kind of crypto bill handout. In reality, this creates a new structure that didn't previously exist. And I think this bill should be viewed as a geopolitical bill for the United States, a way to extend dollar dominance and create a new buyers of U.S. debt at a time when it is crucial. You'll hear me and Beimnet talk about the need for new buyers of U.S. debt. Right now, let's get right to Beimnet Abebe. Let's go now to our friend Beimnet Abebe from Galaxy Trading. As always, Beimnet, welcome back to Galaxy Brains, sir.
Thank you for having me.
What a fun time it's been over the last week. You and I were there at NASDAQ on Friday, ringing the bell. And today, it was a great day. But also today on May 21st, we're recording Wednesday, Bitcoin new all-time high at 100 almost 110K. Just as we record this around 2 p.m. Eastern, has sold off back to 106.4K. What equity markets down today? A lot of volatility in the market today, both up and down in Bitcoin and in traditional markets. What is the story right now in your mind?
I think we are seeing a breakdown in global fixed income. And, whatever market you look at in G10, you've seen a massive move higher in back-end yields. The most notable is in Japan, where you've got the 30 and 40-year parts of their curve like well north of 3% now. And that's crazy to think about because, for most of my, trading career, Japan has been in negative interest rate policy, and they have been conducting yield curve control. And so, you're now starting to get to a moment where bonds are kind of in price discovery. And in the U.S., what caused this, last bit of a flush is a poor 20-year auction that tailed by 1.5 bips. But structurally, the story around the deficit and spending and the debt has not gotten any better. The most recent spending and tax bill that's working its way through Congress at the moment most certainly adds to the deficit. And you are talking about deficit to GDP levels that are in the 7% ballpark for 2026 and 2027. And we were told that we're trying to get them to 3% by best and slowly over time, but it looks like we're going in the opposite direction. And when rates move higher, your interest expense only goes higher, and so you've got to refinance more. And so it's a little bit reflexive in the sense that the higher rates go, the more debt you have to issue to just cover your interest expenses. And then in the UK, you had a surprise higher in inflation that caused the UK bond market to sell off. And in the story in Europe is they're going to be spending more money, and so they have to finance that with debt. And so there's really a culmination of factors that are causing the back end globally to sell off. But just taking a step back from those metrics, like bond yields are still relatively subdued, especially in the back end compared to the front end. What I mean by that is the level of term premium that is in the market right now is not consistent with historical levels of term premium, especially when nominal growth domestically and abroad is expected to be where it's at. And so like just on the term premium normalizing to historical levels, like you still have more room for back end bonds to sell off. And so, the fiscal stuff doesn't line up. The supply, just think about this. The U.S. has to fund $2.5 trillion a year, at least on a go forward basis. And where is that money going to come from to buy these bonds? Right. And so ultimately, I do think that, one of the reasons why Bitcoin is at an all-time high and that gold is, basically at an all-time high is the reality is central banks will have to print money and buy fixed income, right? The money printer will eventually have to go brr. And that is what, these assets like Bitcoin and gold are telling you.
Yeah.
And so
Was
it's not
that the French version of burr? It was burr. Money printer go bear.
Yeah.
No, I hear you.
And what makes this all worse though is the Fed can't really act by cutting rates right now because like there's still inflation. You're still talking about core PCE that's well above target. Tariffs are meant to be inflationary, and realistically, if we do believe in the Trump administration's thesis that nominal growth is going to be really high because of all the investment that's going to come into the US, like are you really going to be cutting rates into a nominal economy that's growing at 5-6% a year, right? And if we are really growing like that, you don't think inflation is going to be an issue? And you're still dealing with a fairly tight labor market, although there are some signs of deterioration. And so the Fed's on hold, so that they're not cutting rates. And you have all this pressure on the back end. And so it's really culminating to really kind of test, the government's resolve on what they're able and willing to do to defend the back end of the curve.
Yep. Yeah. And it has been just a straight up, I mean, Secretary Besson was talking about his 333 plan, right? There was all this talk about how crucial the 10-year, but the long bond anyway is, and they have not been able to get it down. It went down as low as 3.8% the 10-year at first,
yeah,
and it's just been grinding higher since then. But you're saying too, this is the world's governments, right? It's not just the US.
The world, but here's the thing: it's one of those things where, as a collective of like investors and money managers in the world, like everyone knows that the fiscal path is unsustainable, right? And so Paul Tudor Jones describes it best. It's like being in an arena watching WWE, like it's fake, right? And there might be like a moment where everybody realizes, like at the same time, like, oh, this is fake and productionalized. Like, why am I buying into this as if it's real? And so the question is, are we getting closer to that moment?
A full realization, basically.
Yes, and then, but ultimately, like what has always happened is central banks step in.
Yeah.
Right. Treasury does buybacks. Yellen issues less back end bonds and more T-bills. we improve the regulatory hurdles for banks to own more fixed income on the balance sheet, right? These are all things that effectively kick the can down the road,
Yeah.
but don't get to like the core issue, which is we spend way more money than we have. And in a positive interest rate world, like there is a limit to how much you can effectively borrow in terms of ultimately being sustainable.
Right.
And so I think the market is waking up to that. And I think Bitcoin and gold, are the clear kind of winners in a breakdown in confidence in treasuries. But realistically, we're all losers in that scenario.
Well, you can try to protect yourself, and it looks like more and more people are, with both gold and Bitcoin doing great this year. Bitcoin with a lot of volatility, but it's been going on for a couple of years too. I remember us talking on this show over a year ago about how the bond market and gold were flashing really troubling signs for this, that Wall Street had figured it out. Finally, the gold bugs day had finally come. The markets were finally realizing and starting to price the unsustainability of the fiscal pathway. The new budget that's, like you said, working its way through Congress was the impetus for the Moody's downgrade. Finally, now all three major credit ratings have downgraded the U.S. ratings agencies because it adds $1 trillion plus of new deficit spending. It doesn't cut, it adds.
I mean, it's more over like by 2030. Like I think the figures are like closer to like $3 trillion by 2030, which is a lot.
Do you have any confidence long term that the way the U.S. political system is set up, that anyone will be able to make these hard choices, or is the 2, 4, and 6 year election cycle make it impossible to justify austerity? Basically,
nobody wins running on austerity.
Yeah,
you can't win a political election being like, I'm going to send you less money. People vote with their wallet.
Not just that, I might also need to take more from you as well.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I'm going to tax you more and I'm going to, spend less on you. Like that's not a winning argument. And when you have congressmen that are on 2-year election cycles, right? Like it's impossible for somebody that is focused on reelection, basically like 6 months after they get their job, for them to think structurally about what makes sense from a policy standpoint for the next 6 years or 8 years, right? And so nobody has the political capital to actually deal with these structural issues. Now, one would argue that a second-term president does, right? And I honestly applaud Trump and the administration for making an initial attempt at basically being like, we need to cool the economy to get rates down, to be able to finance our debt better, and to get debt to GDP to somewhere closer to 3%. But ultimately what happened was, when you do that, that's going to take down risk markets. And S&P and NASDAQ rolled by 20+%. And all of a sudden, the administration policy kind of flipped a little bit. And so, like they basically got stopped out, and even a second-term president has a stop-out level with this stuff, because realistically, like markets are incredibly complacent right now. And don't take my word for it. Jamie Dimon said it this week, right? The multiples that some of these companies trade at, like the ridiculous valuations across all asset classes, right? And so there's a lot of froth, and people will get hurt if we do the right things. Right? The right thing to do is to get deficit spending lower, to get your debt to deficit ratio to 3%, or deficit to debt ratio to 3%. That is the long run sustainable average. Like that's what you should do. But cutting spending by that much, like you're not going to help risk assets, like by definition, right? And so, like, we have some hard pills to swallow, and I don't think anybody has the appetite to swallow those hard pills. And so what's happening is the market is forcing the issue.
Yep, it is. Well, let's keep it. Man, this saga, turns out markets, they get ever more exciting the longer you watch. Beimnet Abebe from Galaxy Trading, my friend, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Let's go now to our guest, Dr. Bradley Rettler from the University of Wyoming Bitcoin Research Institute, professor of philosophy at the University of Wyoming, and senior fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute. Brad, thank you so much for coming on Galaxy Brains.
Thanks for having me, Alex. Good to talk with you.
Yeah, longtime fan of yours and your work. We want to talk with you about the book that you co-authored with Andrew Bailey and Craig Wormkey, Resistance Money, the philosophical case for Bitcoin, want to ask you, what in the world is the University of Wyoming's Bitcoin Research Institute, and what are you guys doing over there? And then we'll talk a little bit about BPI, the Bitcoin Policy Institute, of which you are a senior fellow, and whatever they're doing coming up. So that's the agenda. But first, Brad, I've got to ask you, you are a little bit of a rapper. Is that right?
Just a little bit, yeah.
I know that. Yeah, I think our audience knows that I dabble. Maybe we'll link to some of your rap in the show notes. We won't, I think, bother the world with both of us attempting to freestyle here now. But and also, we hung out a lot in Bedford. Both, I guess, real Bedford ultras. You and I.
Yeah. Big fans of the club. Seen him through many promotions. Some of us even got to walk out onto the field as the ladies team clinched the league title in one promotion.
Brad, let's talk first about Resistance Money. You guys published this great book, The Philosophical Case for Bitcoin, last year. At a high level, it's a philosophy book. It's not a general history of money, although it has lots of that in there. What was the impetus, and maybe how would you describe how it's differentiated from other of the many other Bitcoin books out there?
I think it's differentiated in a couple ways. So the idea was to write an academic book that had plenty of footnotes and citations to appease the academics, that's published by an academic press so that it could be in university libraries and local libraries and have that sort of stamp of approval of a publishing house, but also at the same time be accessible for everyone. So I was regularly giving snippets to my parents and saying, like, do you understand this? Does this make sense to you? And then we just think that Bitcoin is a topic that touches a lot of different academic disciplines, and that philosophers have something to say about it. Also, that philosophy is kind of a discipline that involves a lot of other disciplines. So, like, we teach philosophy of technology, philosophy of environment, all these different things. You can have a philosophical take on them. And so we wondered, what would a philosophical take on Bitcoin look like? We were all interested in Bitcoin already. And the idea was that philosophy could provide a framework for thinking about all these other different areas. And the framework is this thought experiment where you imagine that tomorrow when you wake up, you could be anyone in the world. And there's an equal chance for each person of you waking up as that person. Would you want to wake up as some random person in a world with Bitcoin or a world without Bitcoin? So this forces you to get past your positive or negative biases toward Bitcoin. You don't know whether you're going to own any. You don't know whether you're going to use it. But would you want to wake up in a world where it existed? And then we, for the rest of the book, go through who Bitcoin is good for, who Bitcoin is bad for. And it turns out that Bitcoin is, we think, good for more people than it's bad for. And the people that it's good for are the ones who are like using it to survive. And the people that it's bad for are people that are okay anyways. People who have staked their reputation on Bitcoin being bad. And they would be slightly better off if Bitcoin disappeared, because then they wouldn't have made such stupid claims in the past, or they'd have been right about those claims. So, there are a few people that Bitcoin harms through, extrinsic externalities about maybe, say, major Bitcoin miners that make noise, and the people that live really close by might be harmed. There are people who have lost a lot of money on Bitcoin trying to gamble with it or trade it or things like that. So they'd be slightly better off if Bitcoin didn't exist. But then there are also people who are using Bitcoin because their local currency is hyperinflating, or they're trying to stay ahead of their authoritarian government. And like, Bitcoin is a lifeline for them. It's literally keeping them alive. And so that those positives should weigh much more heavily than the negatives.
Yeah, it's a net benefit is the sort of where you come out, and it is a methodical and deliberate exposition of this thought experiment and this way of examining Bitcoin. So I do encourage people to read it. How has the book been received in the philosophy community?
The people who have read it have really liked it. there are a lot of people who have criticized it without reading it, which doesn't usually happen in the philosophy community. If you write a book on like Kant's ethics, a new take on Kant's ethics, people don't say like that book is crap, unless they've read it, and then they might say that. So it's interesting that Bitcoin is something that people feel free to criticize books about without reading. But yeah, the people that I've talked to that have read it have uniformly praised it, not just as a good piece of philosophy, but actually as a good example of how philosophy can be relevant to everyday life. It's almost not just a case for Bitcoin, but it's a Bitcoin-based case for the importance of philosophy.
I think that's really interesting and important. I minored in philosophy in college and loved particularly political philosophy, but also you don't think about philosophy a lot if you're not in academia. I don't know a lot of people in sort of their everyday lives who are actively thinking about philosophy. They may live their life with certain principles that are philosophical in nature or whatever, but like contemplating, debating the canon of philosophy or different schools of thought is not something that is that prominent. So I love that angle of it, that not only obviously you're bringing Bitcoin into an academic sense, and you've written a book that's really good about Bitcoin that everyday people can utilize, but the fact that it promotes philosophy as a subject in the sort of mainstream world, I think is quite powerful.
Yeah, thanks. I think a lot of people do philosophy without realizing that they're doing philosophy. They make choices. They make claims about what's right or wrong. They decide what they believe about God. These are all philosophical things. They're just not realizing that they're doing philosophy, and often they're doing it pretty badly. And so, if you're going to be doing philosophy anyways, you may as well do it well.
Can you tell me about some of and this maybe dovetails a little bit into HRF and BPI stuff, but give a couple examples for the audience of case studies of people using Bitcoin as resistance money, as opposed to, financial speculation or store of value use cases. You guys go through a number of these examples, as you mentioned, but in the book, what are some that stick out to you as really powerful resistance money uses, not use cases, specific examples?
Yeah, my favorite is the example that when I first heard about Bitcoin, was one of the first stories that I heard. I think it was published in Time magazine a decade or so ago. And it's about a person who I've since met and talked about. And I'm not sure that she realizes that she's like a minor celebrity to me. But it's Roya Mahbub, who was living in Afghanistan and running a software company and was employing a lot of women. And women in Afghanistan are not allowed to own property, including money. They regularly get their wages confiscated by their fathers or husbands, and it makes them really hard to live lives of freedom. They are trapped in many different ways. And so she started paying a portion of their salaries in Bitcoin. And so they'd still have to relinquish the money that they were getting, but they were able to build up some financial assets of their own and could then make free choices about what they wanted to do with their lives, including in some cases, leave abusive husbands and strike out on their own. Also, there's a story about a Venezuelan economist who was, living in Venezuela during a time of rapid, probably not technically hyperinflation, but really close, and who knew that if he left the country through some checkpoint with any amount of any kind of physical cash, he was going to get searched, his stuff was going to get stolen. So converted it all to Bitcoin, memorized seed phrase, left Venezuela to Colombia, and then I can't remember, maybe ended up in the US someday. Seed phrase still memorized, and was able to then access his wealth there. Incredible. And then, of course, perhaps the most famous case is that of Alexei Navalny, who was the Russian opposition leader, who was debanked so many times, and just clearly bank accounts were being spied on and things like that, that started accepting donations in Bitcoin so that people in Russia could donate without the government knowing that they were donating. He could buy things without the government knowing he was buying things, and ended up conducting for the rest of his life. Almost all of his financial transactions were in Bitcoin, and his funeral in the end was paid for in Bitcoin.
Wow. Incredible. And, just to dovetail to you guys also talk a bit about the Ukraine war and all the capital controls and sanctions and how normal people can also turn to it. And I raise this only because, Roya is a Human Rights Foundation fellow or something, whatever they call it. Incredibly inspiring. But Alex Gladstein, who is the chief strategy officer at HRF, has been a longtime advocate of using Bitcoin as resistance money. And I recall I think the first time I ever heard about Bitcoin was when during the Euromaidan protests, there were Ukrainian pro-democracy protesters seeking support with Bitcoin, holding up QR codes and stuff and saying, send us Bitcoin, right? Because they weren't similarly capital controls, their opposition party or whatever movement. And I was like, what is Bitcoin? And I later learned years later that was Gladstein had been helping them with that. And Alex, now a good friend of mine and also has been on this pod. So like similar sort of to you of like, you heard about Roya and then later now Roy. And there really are, I always want to stress this, that there are people who depend on Bitcoin. It's not just people hoping for number go up, right? Or even investors. It's a lot of people that actually use the thing. And that doesn't harm anyone, right? I mean, in your book, you guys explain this, like who is harmed by, the Venezuelan economist or Roya or by using this to protect their wealth or to gain liberty, right?
No, I don't think anybody is harmed by individuals using Bitcoin. I think there's nothing intrinsic to Bitcoin or Bitcoin use that is harmful to either users or non-users. It's all sort of things external to the Bitcoin network, like maybe the amount of energy that's used in mining or the amount of noise that miners make or people gambling on it or things like that.
Yeah, or like if you're a big bank and somehow Bitcoin like is used so much that you get less business, but that's just normal business disruption, right? That's markets. That's not. It wouldn't be fair to blame Bitcoin for being innovative. Another thing that you mentioned before too, related to philosophy, was like philosophy of the environment, and that has been a big debate over the years. I wouldn't say a very coherent one, but it seems the tide has turned. Your co-fellow at BPI, Troy Cross, has done a lot of work on this. Whether or not Bitcoin mining is bad for the environment, right? And I mean, have you seen? It seems like through Troy's work, through Daniel Batten's work, and many others, the tide has now turned here, and it feels like people actually understand that using electricity is not inherently bad for the environment. And by the way, it's also what delineates a thriving from a failing society. Have you seen movement in your circles on that narrative improving?
Yeah, it's very slow. So academia moves very slowly and opinions change very slowly. So I definitely think that academia is actually behind the general public in this area right now. But yeah, I think when I talk to people about Bitcoin, that used to be the first question that I would get if I was just giving a talk at a university to people who didn't know much about Bitcoin. They would always ask about the environment first. These days, it's about volatility and about sanctions evasion. And there's still environment questions later on, but there's just so much more to say about how Bitcoin is using renewable energy, even incentivizing renewable energy, is cleaning up waste methane and things like that. There's distinctions to be made, as we do in the book, about rivalrous versus non-rivalrous energy. So a lot of the energy that Bitcoin uses that does come from fossil fuels would be used anyway. And then now all of these different companies who are actually making money. So these aren't like charities, but like what Eric is doing with Gridless in Africa, electrifying villages using Bitcoin mining, and then sort of moving on to the next village. And he said people always want to talk to me about this, and they always classify it as this, like charity that they could donate to. But we're actually making money doing it. This is a profitable enterprise to electrify these Kenyan villages, and it's only profitable because we're doing it with Bitcoin. So if other companies did this, it's not like they need to be given donations or something like that. They could actually also make money. So yeah, I think this is catching on with people. And then of course, stories about how Bitcoin is enabling grid stability and overbuilding of grids for those catastrophic events. For example, in Texas with extreme heat and extreme cold, you need really high baseline power generation, more than you is financially makes sense to create, except for Bitcoin, who is always willing to use any amount of energy that it can get, and then is also willing to turn off during periods of high demand to provide air conditioning in Texas summers or heating in Texas winters.
Yeah, it's really I get it. Like, it sounds like it's bad. The sort of degrowth wing of the far left has sort of disposed of all nuance related to this. They said that merely using a lot of electricity is bad. But also there was a lack of understanding, I think, broadly, and still for sure is, about how electricity even works, like how grids work, right? How like every watt that my office here in New York is currently consuming was just produced moments ago. There is no you have to be constantly producing, right? It's alternating current. It's not coming out of a battery. It has to be flowing right when it's needed, right? And so you always have to overproduce. People don't really get that. I don't think people realize when you turn on the light, the electricity for that light was already produced now. It's flowing into your building at that exact moment, waiting for you to need it. And if
you don't use it, then it has it has to go somewhere. It doesn't just sort of I wasn't used, I'm going to disappear from existence. It has to be grounded somewhere and go somewhere else.
That's right. All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the University of Wyoming's Bitcoin Research Institute. You lead this institute, Dr. Bradley Rettler, and you guys founded this a year ago, about almost a year ago now, I think last summer, right? You launched this. Tell us, and by the way, I should say, as far as I am aware, it is the first academic center in the U.S. that is specifically and exclusively dedicated to studying Bitcoin. What is the UW Bitcoin Research Institute, Brad?
Yeah, that's right. So we announced it last summer, but as the gears of academia grind slowly, I don't officially take the position of director until July, and I was not allowed to spend any of the money that was raised for this until July as well. So we've just been sort of sitting on that for a while. That was a decision of administration, and yes, it is. The founding charter and the demands of the donor were that the institute be Bitcoin only. So at the University of Wyoming, we do have a Center for Blockchain and Digital Innovation already that's headed by Steve Lupian. And they do some Bitcoin work. They, in fact, run a lot of Bitcoin miners and do education on physical repair of mining equipment and things like that. But that is also largely funded by Charles Hoskinson. And so they do a bunch of work in other cryptocurrencies as well. So the BRI is Bitcoin only, and it is research focused rather than teaching focused or, business liaison focused. Steve does a lot of work with companies in the area. And our goal at the BRI is to produce academic research. So peer-reviewed academic papers in high-impact journals that can be cited by other academic papers, that can be cited by journalists, by policymakers, and written by people who understand Bitcoin. What we found in writing Resistance Money was that a lot of the academic papers were written by people who just failed to understand some aspect of how Bitcoin worked. Probably the most famous example is this paper by Camilo Mora that was written by his undergraduate students and then published by him and them. That says the title is "Bitcoin Mining Alone Could Push Global Climate Up 2 Degrees." And the idea was that as Bitcoin gets more valuable, more people will buy it and they'll have more transactions and miners will dedicate more energy to it. Blocks will come faster and faster. And eventually, all these miners chasing all these rewards is going to just drive up the energy use. And people who know anything about Bitcoin know that there's a difficulty adjustment that prevents blocks from coming that fast. And it's that very difficulty adjustment that disincentivizes miners from just continuing to use more and more energy. It has to be energy at the right price. But these are undergraduate students and a professor who didn't work in this area and just had no idea that that thing even existed. And so one of the things that the Bitcoin Research Institute wants to also do, in addition to producing and disseminating research, is helping these people who don't understand Bitcoin but want to write about it to make sure that they aren't making factual errors about the Bitcoin system. This paper that I mentioned had 3 responses within a year of being published, but it's still cited constantly. Similarly with Alex DeVries, who was the Doge economist and then Digi economist, just makes some fundamental errors, misunderstanding how Bitcoin works, and still regularly gets cited by even such things as White House publications. So there's just a lack of good vetting going into this, and a lack of experts who actually understand Bitcoin that journalists and policymakers can go to.
Well, it's very cool, and it's much needed. And will it and it's not philosophy focused, right? It'll be across every sort of genre of academia, right?
Yeah, that's right. So we'll probably, for our summer workshops, try to do various clusters. So, for example, if we only get one law professor who wants to come and give a paper on Bitcoin law, we might not be able to provide that good of comments or support. But if we can get 3 or 4 who can all come and then talk to each other and build this network, or people who are working in energy resources or environmental policy, or Bitcoin touches tons of different areas, and we want to bring all of those together and provide resources for all of them. Even if the resource is just more of those kind of people who are interested in Bitcoin, a community.
Yeah, love it. And now let's talk about the Bitcoin Policy Institute. So this is you will lead in July, when it officially begins, the Bitcoin Research Institute, which is based at the University of Wyoming. But you are also a senior fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, which is a Washington, D.C. based organization. What is BPI, and also what does Dr. Bradley Rettler do as a BPI fellow? You smile, you laugh every time I call you that.
I love it.
What do you do as a BPI fellow if you're also doing this other stuff, and how do you see the different relationship between BRI and BPI?
Yeah, I see BRI as sort of underlying and providing information to BPI, and then BPI as the entity that provides that information among other information to policymakers and journalists, specifically in the area of policy regarding Bitcoin at the legal and regulatory levels. So the Bitcoin Policy Institute has existed for 3 or 4 years now, and is growing each year. I think this year we hired 7 or 8 full-time people, moved to DC, established an office in DC, and we'll run the 3rd Bitcoin Policy Summit in a new location, because we outgrew the National Press Club Ballroom where we've held it the last 2 years. So there's an increased interest in Bitcoin from policymakers, of both members of agencies, congressional staff, White House staff, and so on. And so the Bitcoin Policy Institute talks to all of these offices, and also runs this annual major summit that this year I think will be 2 days, and is there to provide information about how academics and business leaders and things like that think about Bitcoin, and what the government ought to do in response to that.
Yeah, it's and so the Bitcoin Policy Summit, the BPS, it's in late June this year, so next month, and I will be there. I assume you will be there, and it's going to be, I mean, gosh, the 180 in Bitcoin's acceptance in Washington, D.C. from a year ago is dramatic. I gave a speech last year called Bitcoin and American Values at the summit, and it was very, very focused on what's good for Bitcoin is also good for America and vice versa, if you look at it this way. And I was really sort of pleading with policymakers to see that. It seems like, at least, nominally at the narrative level, that plea has been heard. Or it's not, I don't have to plea as hard, right? I mean, we see a lot of agreement now on this.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily the areas of Bitcoin that I think are most important that this is seen. So you hear Donald Trump saying that he wants Bitcoin to be made in America, mined in America. And, I don't care so much about that. I do care that Americans can use Bitcoin and access Bitcoin and self-custody Bitcoin. And thankfully, those rights are coming along with, or the acknowledgement of those rights are coming along with these other goals. And so, again, we harken back to Gladstein saying things like, for whatever reason, people are interested in Bitcoin and are willing to promote Bitcoin, it brings along all these other goods with it. And I think that's definitely something that we're seeing with this administration.
Yeah. Well, it's an exciting time. I encourage our audience to visit Dr. Bradley Rettler at the University of Wyoming if you're there, and check out Resistance Money, A Philosophical Case for Bitcoin. That's available everywhere books are sold. It's been number one in like the philosophy category before. It's done well. I do recommend it, especially as you mentioned, for let's just be frank, your parents, your grandparents, your sort of average person, your neighbor that, wants a really straightforward way. It includes a lot of this, but it is not the sort of classic like history of money that, like, there's a bunch of versions of that book out there. But it has that stuff in there. But I do really, really like the sort of first principles philosophical way of saying, like, just put aside all pretend you're an NPC. You are generic human who wakes up the next morning. It's actually a really useful way of thinking about not only Bitcoin, but also a good introduction to using that framework for thinking about other things and what they mean for the world.
The first sentence of the book is Bitcoin is for criminals.
Yeah.
So I feel like it meets people where they're at, even if they're hostile to Bitcoin. And it actually shows why a money that's for criminals is also for anyone.
Yeah.
And it's good for the very same reason.
And it's also just good money, maybe, it turns out. The good, the dollars for criminals too, guys.
Weird.
Yeah, strange. It turns out everyone uses money. Brad, thank you so much. And thank you for coming on Galaxy Brains.
Thanks, Alex.
That's it for this week's episode of Galaxy Brains. Thank you to our guest, Brad Rettler, professor at University of Wyoming and director of the Bitcoin Research Institute there, and our good friend Beimnet Abebe from Galaxy Trading. As always, everyone have a safe and happy weekend, and we will see you next week. Thanks for listening to Galaxy Brains, the weekly podcast from Galaxy Research. If you enjoy the show, please like, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. To follow Galaxy Research, sign up for our weekly newsletter at gdr.email, read our content at galaxy.com/research, and follow us on Twitter at GLXY Research. See you next week.